Hello, welcome everyone to our next panel. My name is Jennifer Donnelly. I will be your moderator today. I see there's still a few people flowing in, but we're just going to start to gradually get started. There's a lot to say in the coming hour and a half. We have two amazing speakers, two amazing women, two amazing teachers with us this afternoon. We're in for a real treat for our panel on the dignity of the saints. I've had the pleasure several times to speak alongside Elizabeth Lev. Today I have the pleasure to introduce her. Elizabeth Lev is an art historian, an author, a tour guide, a sommelier, a mother, many things, currently living in Rome. She's a graduate of the University of Chicago and of the University of Bologna, where she pursued her graduate work before settling permanently in Rome in the Eternal City. She teaches at Duquesne University's Italian campus and is a member of the teaching staff at the Pontifical University of the Anglicum in Rome. She's the author of a number of books, The Tigress of Forli, Roman Pilgrimage, and her latest, a number of others, her latest book, The Silent Night, St. Joseph in Art, will be out next month. And I guess we're going to get a little preview of it today. Our second speaker, Sister Anne, professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. I think we have a number of her students with us today, which is quite a testimony to her legacy and her impact of her work. She's also the author of numerous books. The most recent is Eating Beauty, the Eucharist and the Spiritual Arts of the Middle Ages. And she's currently completing a monograph on hagiography and the Bible. Amongst her many distinctions, she has been the recipient of an NEH Fellowship, a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. Among her publications, she has edited 8 collections of essays, most recently Saving Fear in Christian Spirituality. She's a past president of the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality and also of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, and has published recently in Cistercian Studies, Quarterly, Spiritus, Theological Studies, Marian Studies, Religion, Literature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So enough from me. I welcome our two distinguished speakers. Liz will be speaking first, followed by Sister Anne. We'll have hopefully time for questions afterwards, and everyone enjoy.
So as an art history professor of 20 years, I know the danger of turning off the lights, putting on pictures after lunch. I know you guys call it art in the dark. So I'm asking St. Joseph to help keep you guys awake. So when it comes to imagery and the art, St. Joseph in art, in many ways, the thought that just always occurs to me is, you've come a long way, baby. Because we start with a man who basically has a total of 15 mentions in the Bible. He has no lines whatsoever, and he's gone by chapter 2 of both Matthew and John. This man never would have had a Screen Actors Guild card. And yet, over the course of centuries, he's gone from being the most unobtrusive figure in the history of art to someone who is really omnipresent. He's everywhere, that Joseph. And in some ways, going from a kind of Joseph who was forgotten, left in the background, this kind of the lack of the recognition of Joseph in the early period of art, we've gone to kind of the opposite end of the scale, where Joseph has become so ubiquitous that, he's sort of either that trite figure that kind of always add to the creche scene. He's that kit you get for like selling your house, is like a real estate toy. Or there's always this, which is probably best left not discussed. But here, my point today, my presentation today, is to tell you about the long struggle that St. Joseph had in order to be recognized and in order to become one of the most strikingly popular figures among some of the most creative minds in the history of art. When you look at the artists who have tackled the question of what does St. Joseph look like, it's really a remarkable number of really incredible artists. So I'm going to be doing just a very brief panorama of a Joseph who started out left off to the side, actually, originally not even present, to a Joseph to today. And what should we do today? How can art hold up Joseph in this modern era? So that's 2,000 years, so we better get started. And let's start with these early Paleo-Christian scenes. So here we have on Christian sarcophagi, the Vatican Museum is filled with them. We have the lovely image of the Virgin, the child. We can manage an ox and an ass and a random shepherd, but guess who's missing? Joseph. And it's a very, very kind of odd thing, whether you're looking in catacomb paintings or these early sarcophagi from the 2nd century AD, when the Christians first started to experiment with art, to the 3rd, 4th century AD, they just leave Joseph out of the picture. And that's for a couple of reasons, and they're very valid reasons. I mean, the first reason is very simple. You're making art for Gentiles, and you're trying to explain to the Gentiles about the virgin birth. And you're trying to explain the divine paternity of Jesus. Now, Gentiles, the Greco-Romans, are really used to lust-crazed deities dropping by to impregnate women left and right, whether dressed as birds or beasts. So, this is not like the idea of some woman giving birth by a god is not news to them. So what they really need to do is emphasize the virginity of Mary. And for that reason, Joseph, as a gentleman, takes a step off to the side and allows Mary and allows the child to shine. We can already see that tremendous sense of service that we'll have in the art of St. Joseph. The other reason is that there's really nothing to go on with St. Joseph, right? How are we going to glean what he looks like from, 15 lines in scripture? Where are we going to build this story from? And so eventually the way that the church, the way that Christians will fill in this enigmatic character is by adding, apocrypha, stories that come outside of the canon of the Bible, but they fill in what was Joseph like, and these are invented stories, or at least as far as we know. So some of them get a little bit off track. So Joseph the widower having some kind of crisis because he's marrying a young girl. I mean, there's a lot of sort of strange storytelling that goes off in the side. But eventually, Joseph does make his appearance, and amazingly enough, his first appearance comes at the exact same moment that Mary is declared Theotokos. In Ephesus 4:31, we announce Mary as the God-bearer. So this great dogma, and all of a sudden, in the first church to Mary in the West, St. Mary Major, built to celebrate that, look who shows up, Joseph. Joseph in the triumphal arch mosaics of St. Mary Major appears not once, but 5 times. He out-appears even Jesus and Mary. So all of a sudden, he's everywhere in the triumphal arch. And look at him. He's dressed up. You see him here. The Annunciation to the Virgin is on your left. On the right is Joseph, chatting it up with the angel, wearing his little short tunic of a courtier. And notice he is not an old man. He's a young man. He's actually got a little bit of that Roman soldier look about him, someone who's there. He's ready to take on this responsibility to be the caretaker of this woman and child. And he'll appear over and over again in the mosaics. He actually somehow ages rapidly. I guess that's what becoming a father does. You see him next time at the presentation at the temple, suddenly sporting gray hair. Then we see this privileged communication with angels, kind of running through the gamut of his responsibilities. This very interesting divine communication. You have him presenting, this is actually an apocryphal story. You have Joseph presenting Jesus to the Gentiles. So here's this Egyptian tribe that they encounter on the flight to Egypt, and it's Joseph in the foreground putting forth his foster son. And then, of course, Joseph stands at the far corner of the adoration of the Magi. I always think this is sort of sweet. He's standing at the far corner, pushing forward the Magi as if he's about to step off stage. So here you go. Now I've introduced you. I'll just let you 2 connect, or you 3 connect, or you 4 connect, or however many there are. And that actually leads into what happens in Joseph's iconography. Joseph then disappears all over again. And it's during a period of struggle as we work out heresies and the church is trying to find its footing. And so suddenly he reappears in the 6th century as this kind of old crabby guy. And people are pulling from, artists are pulling from the apocryphals. And what they're drawing out of the apocryphal stories is the troubled Joseph, the Joseph who was kind of concerned about, like, what am I going to do? And she's Mary and I'm Joseph. So you pull out this sort of strange, older, troubled Joseph. And I think more poignantly, he's always turned away. They turn him away again in a way of showing, in an attempt to show his non-appartenance to Jesus's conception, right? So they kind of put him off in the corner, facing in the other direction, and like everything is going on the other side. As a matter of fact, it looks kind of like Joseph is in charge of tending the animals. So, Joseph makes this big, arrival as a Roman courtier, the most dignified, handsome guy you can imagine. And then he goes off to be like this sort of little round, sad figure in the corner. Joseph needs a big push. He needs a good PR guy. And he's going to get it. He's going to get a whole stream of theologians who are going to become the PR squad for St. Joseph. And once that begins, the versatility of Joseph in his silence, in his sort of enigmatic, quiet personality, the amount of images, the amount of imagination that we can let fly with that Joseph is really quite remarkable. So we have Joseph, a dreamer, comic relief. Yeah, it's coming. A holy father, Mr. Right, the missionary man, and the darling of the good death. And so we have this, and all of this comports changes in how he is visually portrayed by artists. And all of this inspires generations of artists to go to the mat, go back to the drawing table, and rethink Joseph. And that's why we have such a fertile tradition. If you pull out Joseph from the canon of art, you realize there's a very fertile tradition of representing Joseph. These beautiful images, this is particularly the one on the right, which is from Chartres Cathedral, where it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who was one of the first people to really come to the defense of Joseph. This man was like Joseph of the Old Testament. He was a dreamer. He was a man who chose chastity by choice. He lays the groundwork for an image of Saint Joseph that will be something particularly exalted. So really focusing on his angelic communication. That's why you see him in these images where he's dreaming, he's sleeping, he's there present at the event, and yet he's aware of something greater going on around it. Then we go to, this is one of my favorites, we go to just a few years later, a very, very interesting sidestep for Joseph. In Northern Europe, there's an interest in showing Joseph as a kind of figure of fun. He really was comic relief. And so when you look at him in these images of the Nativity, he starts doing really silly things. Now, you'll see him here in the first painting. He's actually playing with the hosen. And this is because a relic of Joseph, this is actually very important, in 1100, a relic of Joseph appears. So he's working his way into the world of saints, into the hagiography, because now there's something of Joseph's. And it turns out what they have of Joseph's were his stockings or his shoes or his socks, which apparently he removed in order to make swaddling clothes for Jesus. So this poor man who has nothing else to give but his own shoes, removes his shoes, tears them up so as to be able to create something to cover his child. And it's really interesting when you see him juxtaposed with the wise men, which I didn't put in this presentation, or we'd be here all night. But juxtaposed with the wise men, you'll see sometimes he's wearing an outfit that is similar to that of one of the wise men. And so, yes, they came with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but we see Joseph as the one who comes with the first necessities from his own body. He gives his own belongings. So on one hand, it looks silly. But on the other hand, it holds up the dignity of the simplest, humblest gift, but is the most personal of gifts, and therefore more exalted than the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Or sometimes he's just trying to get the fire going. Or somebody's trying to help with the bath and getting yelled at by the nursemaid. And then in my favorite, Hieronymus Bosch, who actually has, this is literally a Where's Waldo? Hey, where's Joseph? Yeah, he's drying diapers over in the corner. And of course, people like Bernardino of Siena are like, oh my goodness, how can you do that to the dignity of this man, this important man? How can you? They're very, very angry. We Italians get all very upset about it. And yet, the secret to Joseph, much of Joseph's secret is in these images, because it makes us think a little bit about it from the Northern Europeans' point of view. So wait a minute. So there's this guy who is kind of like a carpenter who suddenly gets called to be there with a bunch of kings and God and incarnation and angels and what on earth? And what's he going to do? Like, what exactly is he going to do? Like, what else is there? Like, shall I boil some water? And so that sense of what do we do? Like, what do we do in the face of salvation? What do we do in the incredible things that God has done for us? Like, yeah, I think I'll say a rosary. It's a way of taking our little offerings of ourselves, our own little witness, and giving it a dignity through that of Joseph, who we begin to see found a place. And we're more comfortable relating to Joseph because Joseph lets us laugh at him. It's easy to just kind of be like, oh, yeah. And then all of a sudden we realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm like Joseph. It's like, really, what would we be doing? Drying diapers, okay? So it's a very, very interesting, and that is the secret, I think, in all of this. The way that Joseph manages to break open and become what you all know, the patron of the universal church, because he really can talk to everyone. But literally from the stable to the stars, from the stelle alle stalle, reversing the Italian phrase, we start out with Joseph, we just had Joseph drying diapers in a stable. But come the 13th century, Joseph undergoes a rather dramatic transformation where he becomes doppelganger to St. Peter. So imagine the leaps that Joseph is making. And this is, again, another pocket of the church. This is another issue in the church, because the 11th century is a very, very difficult period for the church. It's a difficult period for the prestige of the papacy. It's a difficult period for the dignity of the papacy. When we read about anybody who knows your 11th century history, what went on in the 900s, not a pretty period for the papacy. And then continuing, so already this voice begins to start like, well, what kind of man should the Pope be? Who should the Pope aspire to be like? What is the best role model for the Holy Roman Pontiff? And this continues to sort of to percolate in the minds of the church and in the minds of artists until we get to the critical moment of the late 1300s, where we actually have three popes. Right? So sort of a travesty of the papacy. One pope, two popes, three popes. Like, what is this? And that is the moment where we start to get an actual articulation of Peter Joseph as a role for Peter. So this is the popes in Avignon, returning from Avignon. And we have these two wonderful thinkers. This is a Franciscan on the left, Peter John Olivi, who talks about the role of Joseph as father as God. It represents God the Father or Christ because he is the spouse of the church. And in the Christian religion, which, like Mary, conceived the evangelical word through the Spirit of Christ, Joseph is also the image of the Roman pontiffs, installed as the guardians of the church. And then we have Jean Gerson, who will be the big one, this is the Chancellor of Paris, whose writings on Joseph, he actually writes a poem called the Josephinum. He's really one of the major figures, and if you will, our PR squad for Joseph, who says, let him be made, he's speaking of the Pope, let him be made the betrothed and shepherd to the church, and let the whole world obey him. This man is Joseph, who he prays will honor and make sacrifices to his betrothed, the Virgin. And what happens in art? All of a sudden, you can't tell them apart. So in Giotto's, the washing of the feet from the Arena Chapel, and then Giotto's the flight into Egypt. Look at them. Joseph and Peter are essentially the same person. So this becomes a very sort of frequent image in art, where we see the marriage of the marriage of the Virgin with Joseph, but at the same time the delivery of the keys. These are both by Perugino. And so the idea of this pairing of the two, holding up the papacy and giving Joseph this whole new role as a truly holy father, to be a model to the Holy Father. And then it is a pontiff, Sixtus IV, who takes the big leap during his pontificate, 1471 to 1484. He is the one who decides it's time for a Joseph Day. which is actually, there are a whole bunch of days, but this is time for the official Joseph Day, which is March 19th. And that will allow the church, artists, and others to really start working on the imagery of Joseph, full-time thinking about what else can Joseph do for us? If Joseph can be a symbol of the Pope, if Joseph can be the everyday guy, what else can Joseph do? Well, Joseph can be the symbol of marriage. And again, he's responding to problems that the church is having at the time, arguments that the church is having, that within the church are taking place between the question of does consummation or consent make up a marriage? And as this argument takes place, who would be a good guy for that consent over consummation? Joseph. And so the images of Joseph, they appear for the first time in the 1400s, and we start to look at over and over and over again this beautiful example of marriage. Let's see, beautiful example of marriage. We have images galore. The beautiful, wonderful Raphael, who does the Marriage of the Virgin, where you'll see this sort of constant emphasis on this consent, this equality, the two being brought together, and the presence of the priest between them, also sort of reiterating the importance of sacramental and public marriage. So these images of the Marriage of the Virgin are meant, they're really densely packed in order to talk about all of the important questions and debates about marriage that are happening in this very critical period of the Renaissance. From there, it's very easy for them to take us into the household of Mary. Once we have the Holy Family, once we have the Marriage of the Virgin, we can enter into their households. And this is how Joseph begins to take his steps as the image of the hardworking father who finds this time for his son. I think these pictures by Georges de la Tour are really extraordinary. This candlelight, Joseph working by candlelight with Jesus holding the light. And so on one hand, you have this very sort of still life type of image of Joseph. He's working the wood. But at the same time, you have this very privileged type of prayer that Joseph experiences. And it brings us all the way back to people like St. Bernard, who were among the first to remind us that Joseph got to hold in his arms God. He got to cuddle with him, nuzzle him, smell his hair, that incredible intimacy that allowed him a knowledge of Christ, a knowledge of the incarnation, which is absolutely privileged. And we see that prayer, that deepening of knowledge taking place even further in these beautiful images of Georges de la Tour, where Jesus may be holding the light for him to finish his work at night. But really what Jesus is the light that is the direction of all of his work, and this incredible relationship they have. And then, of course, Maria's. How can you possibly have a presentation on St. Joseph without Maria's painting of the Holy Family with a bird, right? You'd all chase me out. So I put it in. There you go. You're welcome. And so again, beautiful, beautiful image of the Holy Family at home, which becomes a kind of art which people can put into their houses, right? You can use the Holy Family as an inspiration for your own family. These are not altar pieces. These are pieces of art that are meant to go up and be not models for the papacy, but really models for all of us at home to try to recreate this kind of beautiful intimacy where we let the Lord into our life. Well, then he goes global. And that is thanks to some truly extraordinary saints. We have, of course, St. Teresa of Avila, who took the devotion to St. Joseph to a whole new level, dedicating her convents. When she was building new convents, she was building them, the first ones, and many of them were, I think 7 of them, were dedicated to St. Joseph. So she's spreading St. Joseph along with the convents of her newly reformed Discalced Carmelites all over. And her friends and spiritual directors and posse, if you will, are all also helping. Gracian will write this magnificent poem to St. Joseph. He'll write another Josephina, in which he really outlines. He might as well have been the author of this talk. I mean, he outlines the virtues of St. Joseph, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have this great Johannes Molanus, who actually starts telling us how to depict St. Joseph. And he says, don't you do any more of that old man stuff. You should make him look young. You should make him look virile. As a matter of fact, he was probably the person who looked the most like Jesus in aspect, in demeanor, and in comportment. And that's where we get these Murillo images of like Joseph with the flowing hair and the cool beard and sandals and, anyway, hunky Joseph. Anyway, and thanks to this activity, Joseph begins to spread all over the world. From this little pocket, this little group, praying and praying, these Carmelites, they start, and of course, then from there into Spain, the mission of Joseph travels everywhere. He becomes the patron of Mexico. He becomes patron of half the countries in Latin America. He becomes the patron of the Chinese missions. He's going everywhere. He literally has gone global, and he changes his look for it. And so you will see him dressed up here in the Cusco School. This is a painting that was produced in Bolivia, but it's from the Cusco School, where you see him wearing this kind of cool outfit, this kind of bell-shaped outfit, which is supposed to associate him with the Pachatata mountain. Don't get upset. And this sort of, you notice that he has this young Jesus look to him. And then on the opposite side, look what he's doing. Anybody recognize? I feel like I should do a pop quiz here. Anybody recognize that look? That's Mary's look, right? So he's taking these, he's standing side by side with the Virgin, with the image of the protector. So we're used to seeing Mary spreading her cape in order to welcome all of the people who pray to her underneath it. But now we see Joseph taking that position. Go to Joseph, reminds us Gracian. Go to Joseph. And this imagery really invites us to go to Joseph, and he will welcome us. And so here are, and from there, where else to go but to death? And so Joseph, for one last, I think this is our last one, Joseph, one last magnificent, he has many other things, but one last really magnificent thing he is helpful for is the understanding of how to face death. And so in the apocryphal history of Joseph the Carpenter, the history of Joseph the Carpenter really focuses intently on the death of Christ. And so, the death of Joseph. And it is done, it's a story told in the first person by Jesus. And he's describing the death of his foster father. And he talks about how Joseph was so terrified and he could see the demons of Gehenna coming to get him. And Jesus calms him. And he brings down the angels, Gabriel and Michael. The angels, Joseph's been chatting with angels all his life, and the angels personally escort him to heaven. So pretty much, could you ask for a better death than that? And so as the church wants to put forward the idea of dying with dignity, the idea of dying well, Joseph becomes yet again the poster child for another essential teaching of the church. This lovely work by Carlo Maratta shows that moment as Joseph is just being comforted by Christ. The angels are coming down in order to accompany him to the heavens. But that image keeps going so that we can even have a Franz Overbeck in the 19th century creating that peacefulness. He's not only teaching us through these images how we, the moribund, should accept and approach dying. He's also teaching us, those of us accompanying those at the end of our life, how to be with them, how to comfort them, how to behave. So really, these become they're beautiful and they're exciting, but they're also magnificent works of teaching. And that brings us to today. And the opportunity we have today, 2021, Pope Francis has given us the year of St. Joseph, which would probably be connected to why we're actually having this talk, right? Yeah, 3 guesses what gave me this idea. And so, Pope Francis gave us this incredible opportunity to rethink Joseph. The mass of his installation was on March 19th. I remember being there, and I remember how he spoke about Joseph. And I was surrounded by a whole bunch of secular media people who were like, yeah, Pope's seeing it. But the way he spoke about Joseph, the dignity of work, the dignity of men, it really moved them. And so he's opened up this magnificent door for us to think about Joseph. Not that, yes, the magisterium has given us plenty of opportunity to think about Joseph, but now in this exact moment, it's particularly meaningful. I think Joseph, one of the things that the Holy Father brought out is this idea of the person who goes unnoticed. And again, that Joseph, who was the guy drying diapers in the corner, and welcoming and understanding that those people who just do their jobs, who are faithful and quiet and good, can find a solace in Joseph, who is now with this complete body of imagery. We see how great, we have this nuances of how wonderful he is. And then we have the idea of the fatherhood, the problem of fatherhood we face today, and the way that Joseph, these images of Georges de la Tour that really bring us into the intimacy of fatherhood, a busy father who is still a father. And then a patron of those who are fleeing from persecution. I didn't put it in here, but my favorite, one of my all-time favorite of all of them, is from a capital, from a cathedral in Autun, where it's just a carved capital, and you see Mary and Jesus. They're on the donkey being taken out to Egypt, and Joseph is dressed up as a medieval knight with his sword, taking them off to Egypt. And so, there to protect them as they're going off they're escaping from the murderous cohort of Herod. So this idea of these people who are fleeing, and that role of Joseph and being able to be there to protect them, to come up with how to get them to safety. Of course, the patron of workers, which he has been now for 100 years. And the one that I'm the most interested in, and the thing I think was the truly beautiful addition of Patris Corde, was the idea of Joseph's creative courage. The way that Pope Francis speaks about how Joseph is faced with problems that the logical thing to do if you're going to be told, okay, so there's the king is sending a whole bunch of murderers out, the whole squad to kill your kid. What are you going to do? Joseph, no. He finds a solution. He gets the family out of town, which after trying to get in from the South Bend airport to here last night, I'm like, dude, that's impressive. What do you do if you can't call an Uber? So he figures how to get out of town. Then he figures how to support the family. I mean, this creative courage. What does he do? He's on his way to Bethlehem. There's no room at the inn. Now what? She's giving birth. Oh my goodness. Instead of having a nervous breakdown, rocking himself in the corner, he comes up with solutions. What a beautiful notion. What a beautiful way of celebrating the way that you and I solve problems every single day. And it holds up that everyday problem solving, and it makes it beautiful. So where are we going to find that in art? And this is really a challenge that I think Pope Francis has offered us, to be able to think about how do we show Joseph in the 21st century? Because they've managed in all these other centuries, in 1,000 years, to come up with new, inspirational, beautiful images of Joseph. And seriously, the best we can do is a plastic creche scene? And so there are some artists who are out. This beautiful image by Gwyneth Thompson Briggs, which brings out Joseph, this worker, the purity of Joseph. Went the wrong way. This magnificent, I love the Janet McKenzie Holy Family is a stunningly beautiful painting. And of course, Doni McManus, who many of you have met here at this conference before. Doni McManus, who does this very manly, virile St. Joseph. So the question is, what are we going to put forward? What is next for St. Joseph? He's had so many great looks. It would be terrible if our age, with all our information, creativity, resources at our disposal, we can't come up with a Joseph that will inspire us for the next millennium. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Liz. That was wonderful. Sister Anne will be next. I'm going to try to get your things up here.
Elizabeth, that was great. So, all right. So we go on to my talk, Christ Disguised, Human Dignity in the Lives of the Saints. What is human dignity? In what does it consist? Ancient philosophy and Christian theology give strikingly different answers. As Augustine notes in his Confessions, philosophy can name the proper heavenly telos of a human being, but it cannot provide the way for sinful humanity to reach it, a way that can only be opened through the grace of the one mediator, Jesus Christ, who is the way. Simply put, Christian theology ultimately finds human dignity in Christ himself. Christ, the eternal Word, predestined to become flesh. Christ, the Son, the very image of the Father, in whose image and likeness humankind was first created. The incarnation of the Son dignifies human nature, because it was precisely the human form that Christ assumed, in which he suffered and died, and which he glorified by his resurrection and ascension. For Christians, the measure of human dignity is precisely the infinite love with which God has loved humankind in its Maker and Savior. Taking the works of mercy as a standard for judgment, the eschatological judge in Matthew 25:31-46 identifies himself with the hungry, the naked, the thirsting, the sick, the stranger. So much so that the just are surprised and ask, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed thee, or thirsty and give you drink?" On disguising himself, the Lord replies that they have done so whenever they have served the least of his brothers. The anticipated eschatological revelation of the Son of Man in his glory is thus at the same time the full revelation of their human dignity in Christ. Drawing inspiration from this gospel passage, the French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil speaks of the love of neighbor as an implicit form of the love of God, who approaches in the needy neighbor, and whom that neighbor also receives in the person of the respectful benefactor. The humble, serving Christ, alive in the saint, acknowledges and loves Christ in the one being served. In the words of Weil, who but Christ himself can be Christ's benefactor? In this divine exchange, each is a neighbor to the other. Each loves God in the other. Weil speaks of a coexistence between compassion and gratitude. Although the Matthean gospel passage speaks only of Christ's presence in the needy, the legends of the saints illustrate the kind of shared human dignity described by Weil. This dignity is inherent because conferred by God at humanity's creation and redemption, but also dynamic, a dignity graciously realized in the saints as they advance in likeness to Christ through charitable deeds, thus meriting Christ's grateful recognition and reward. The just must be thanked for being just, writes Weil, because justice is so beautiful a thing, in the same way as we thank God because of his great glory. In story after story, a saint serves a disguised Christ in the form of a needy neighbor, only to learn later that he has in fact served Christ. This revelation dignifies not only the poor with whom Christ has identified himself, but also the saint in and through whom Christ himself has performed works of mercy. The stories of the disguised Christ, so frequent in saints' legends, insistently teach the good news of human dignity proclaimed in Matthew 25. They offer a rich trove of variations upon that common theme. Each story is non-identical with the others, however, and when considered closely, yields new insights into the Matthean passage in question. One may in fact consider the hagiographic episodes a kind of mystagogical commentary upon the scriptures, whose word is made flesh, so to speak, in the lives of saints obedient to God's commands. In the time remaining to me, I look briefly at 3 hagiographic episodes involving Christ in disguise. The first from Sulpicius Severus's life of St. Martin of Tours, the second from Raymond of Capua's life of Catherine of Siena, the third from the legend of St. Julian the Hospitaller. The latter combines elements from the legends of Saints Eustace and Hubertus that, taken together, contextualize the teaching on human dignity within the larger frame of respect for all God's creatures. Considered in sequence, the 3 episodes use the motif of Christ's disguise to convey a doctrine of human dignity that is at once exegetical and sacramental, baptismal, Eucharistic, penitential. Hidden in the poor, Christ is also veiled in the sacraments. St. Martin of Tours, the baptismal garment. Sulpicius Severus recounts the story of St. Martin. The story as such is probably familiar to you, but the hagiographer's exact account from the early 5th century deserves close attention. Accordingly, we read, at a certain time, when he had nothing except his arms and his simple military dress, in the middle of winter, a winter that had shown itself more severe than ordinary, so that the extreme cold was proving fatal to many, he happened to meet at the gate of the city of Amiens a poor man destitute of clothing. He was entreating those that passed by to have compassion upon him, but all passed the wretched man without notice. When Martin, that man full of God, recognized that a being to whom others showed no pity was, in that respect, left to him. The hagiographer refers to Martin as a man full of God. Although Martin at this time in his life is not yet a baptized Christian and still a soldier in Caesar's army. The naked beggar, by contrast, is barely holding on to his mortal existence in a severe cold felt by all, a cold that should have awakened at least a sensual empathy in others. Denying any notice to him, showing him no pity, the unkind bystanders have in effect treated the beggar as someone less than human, someone of a kind, a species different from themselves. Martin, however, notices the man, pays attention to him, and recognizes that this man has been left to him as his responsibility. The sheer attention Martin pays to the man is already life-giving, dignifying. It also demands an action of renunciation on Martin's part. He must become less that the beggar may become more. Yet, what should he do? He had nothing except the cloak in which he was clad, for he had already parted with the rest of his garments for similar purposes. Taking therefore his sword, with which he was girt, he divided his cloak into 2 equal parts, and gave one part to the poor man, while he again clothed himself with the remainder." Unquote. The exactly equal division of the robe gives, as it were, a mathematically perfect symbolic expression of the command to love one's neighbor as oneself. The robe is like a second skin to cover the shivering flesh of Martin and the beggar alike. Dividing the cloak equally, Martin affirms the beggar's human dignity to be equal to his own. The episode wonderfully illustrates Simone Weil's insight when she writes, quote, "The supernatural virtue of justice consists in behaving exactly as though there were equality when one is the stronger in an unequal relationship. He who treats as equals those who are far below him in strength really makes of them a gift of the quality of human beings, of which fate had deprived them. As far as it is possible for a creature, he reproduces the original generosity of the Creator with regard to them. This is the most Christian of virtues," unquote. Like the two-edged sword of the Scriptures, Hebrews 4:12, in obedience to which Martin uses his sword to divide his garment, Martin's action stirs a divided reaction in the onlookers. Quote, "Upon this, some of the bystanders laughed, because Martin was now an unsightly object and stood out as but partly dressed. Many, however, who were of sounder understanding groaned deeply, because they themselves had done nothing similar. They especially felt this because, being possessed of more than Martin, they could have clothed the poor man without reducing themselves to nakedness," unquote. When Martin clothes himself in half a robe, he appears ridiculous to some who now mock him as someone less than themselves, equal to a mere beggar. Others, however, have the opposite reaction. They themselves feel ashamed, knowing that they have not dignified themselves by acting in a humane way. In their eyes, Martin stands as their ethical superior, both because he clothed the beggar and because he did so at a real cost to himself. The legend does not record the immediate response of the beggar. Was he grateful? Did he think Martin was crazy to act the way he did? Was he resentful because Martin gave only half of his cloak? The legend elides these questions, only to answer them in a different visionary context, rich with Christological content. Quote, "In the following night, when Martin had resigned himself to sleep, he had a vision of Christ arrayed in that part of his cloak with which he had clothed the poor man. He contemplated the Lord with the greatest attention and was told to own as his the robe which he had given," unquote. Dressed in Martin's half robe, Christ bears witness to his own dual nature, human and divine, and to the humanity that he, the Son of God, assumed at great cost to himself, out of compassion, making himself like us in all things but sin. Hebrews 4:15. When Christ asked Martin to own as his the cloak Christ now wears, the Lord extends to Martin an elevating equality with himself, an ennobled, divinized human nature, even as he praises Martin for his good deed. The Lord's condescension to Martin in appearing to him rewards Martin's own condescension to the beggar, even as it raises Martin to a share in Christ's own life. The attention Martin pays to the vision of Christ mirrors the attention he had previously given to the beggar. The story continues. Quote, "Ere long, he heard Jesus saying with a clear voice to the multitude of angels standing around, 'Martin, who was still but a catechumen, clothed me with this robe.' The Lord, truly mindful of his own words, who had said when on earth, 'Inasmuch as you have done these things to one of the least of these, you have done them unto me,' declared that he himself had been clothed in that poor man. And to confirm the testimony he bore to so good a deed, he condescended to show himself in that very dress in which the poor man had received. After this vision, we read, the sainted man was not puffed up with human glory, but acknowledging the goodness of God in what had been done, and being now of the age of 20 years, he hastened to receive baptism. The saint acknowledges that it was not Martin, but Christ, alive in Martin, who administered to Christ in the beggar. In the light of this recognition, the garment parted equally between Martin and the beggar, and also shared between Martin and Christ, stands as a prophetic symbol of the baptismal garment Martin comes to wear, the outward sign of his spiritual participation in Christ's own life, death, and resurrection from the dead. That garment and the indelible mark, sacramentum of baptism it represents, will make it impossible for Martin, a soldier of Christ, to continue in military service wearing the emperor's insignia and bound to him by a soldier's oath, sacramentum. A second example, St. Catherine of Siena, the wedding garment of charity, Eucharis. Raymond of Capua's Life of Catherine of Siena records 2 episodes in which Catherine gives alms to Christ himself disguised in a beggar's form. In each case, Christ reveals himself to Catherine in a subsequent vision as the possessor of her gift given to a poor man. While these tales obviously resemble that of St. Martin, they appear in a different narrative context and convey a distinctly Eucharistic theological message. When Catherine ministers to Christ in the poor, she does so specifically as Christ's bride, who has nothing of her own to give. She gives to the poor only what she has been given by God, and materially speaking, by her father Giacomo as a dowry, following her virginal consecration and mystical espousal to Christ. When Christ offers his very self in return to her through the Eucharist, she accepts this kenotic gift into her own nothingness and is recreated, as it were, ex nihilo, to be Christ's bride and helpmate, marked invisibly with his wounds. Charity is, Catherine instructs elsewhere, its own reward. The very dignity of a human being created in the image and likeness of God, who is love. Charity is the bond of their union. After her second encounter with Christ disguised in a poor man, Catherine has a night vision in which she sees Christ holding the tunic she had given him, but it's now decked out with pearls and precious gems. This time, however, Christ's gift in return to Catherine is not merely promised for the future. No, he gives her a piece of clothing, invisible to mortal eyes, a garment the color of blood, taken from the closet of the wound in his side, as a sign and token of the garment of glory to be given to Catherine at the appropriate time. Christ's side wound recalls, of course, the forming of Eve from Adam's rib and the birth of the church, Christ's bride, through water and blood shed at Calvary. Water and blood, baptism and Eucharist. In Catherine's book, The Dialogue, she alludes to the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew 22, 1-14, and refers to, quote, the wedding garment of charity, the garment with which you gain entrance into eternal life, unquote. She records the voice of the Father, who describes the saints as, quote, clothed in the lovely garment the teaching of the Lamb, my only begotten Son, with flaming charity, unquote. The wedding garment of charity, she writes, is adorned with many true virtues, called forth by the needs of one's neighbors. She envisions all the saints who have eternal life, dressed in charity for their neighbors and bathed in the blood of Christ crucified. A third example, St. Julian the Hospitaller, the disguise of penitence and reconciliation. Like St. Christopher, who carried the Lord in the form of a child across the river, St. Julian ferries across a raging stream the Lord in the disguise of a leper, whom he then allows to rest in his own bed. Julian's charitable story is, however, a complicated one, involving two previous misrecognitions, each of them crucial to the next. In the first, the hunter Julian fails to recognize Christ, who speaks to him in the form of a stag to warn him about the consequences of his bloodlust. Quote, "Are you tracking me to kill me, you who are going to kill your father and mother?" Unquote. In the second misrecognition, Julian, arriving home at night, mistakes his sleeping parents in the dark for an adulterous couple, his wife in bed with another man, and he kills them in a fit of jealousy. Julian's final welcome of Christ in disguise atones for his earlier violent denials of the dignity proper to God's creatures. The appearance to Julian of a stag that turns to utter a dire warning parallels episodes in the lives of Saints Eustace and Hubertus, respectively. Eustace follows a deer, outstanding by its size and beauty, into the forest, where at closer range he beholds between the antlers of the stag a shining cross bearing the image of Jesus Christ, who speaks to him through the animal's mouth, directly identifies himself as Christ, and beseeches Eustace's conversion to the faith. Hunting on a Good Friday, not a good thing to do, Hubertus similarly encounters Christ in the form of a stag bearing a crucifix, who calls him to convert, renouncing the aristocratic pleasures of recreational hunting for the sake of a committed Christian life. Unlike Eustace and Hubertus, Julian does not understand that he has been addressed by Christ through the stag, an animal presented in medieval bestiaries as an allegory of Christ, due to its trampling of serpents underfoot and its aiding of fellow deer when they cross through a river. Julian neither perceives the allegory nor does he see a crucifix between the stag's antlers. The stag's speech does not precipitate Julian's conversion to the faith. For Julian, the prediction that he will kill his parents simply prompts him as a latter-day Oedipus to flee from his homeland to avoid such an impious deed. He becomes a mercenary soldier in a foreign army. When Gustave Flaubert retells this tale of St. Julian in his 19th century novella, the predicted murder of Julian's parents seems to be the expected outcome of Julian's sadism in slaughtering animals, and thus a warning issued appropriately through an animal. In Flaubert's retelling, it is Julian's nightmarish resumption of hunting years later that occasions his absence from home on the very day his elderly parents arrive in search of him and are given hospitality by Julian's wife, in whose bed Julian then finds them and kills them. The narrative art of Flaubert presents an argument that a man whose bloodlust delights in the torment and slaughter of animals, who fails to respect them as creatures of God, will also fail to recognize humans in their innate dignity, their right to life. Julian's horrific unblinding finally precipitates his conversion as he, together with his faithful wife, devotes himself as a penitent to the care of travelers, escorting them, deer-like, across the swift currents of a river and caring for their needs. Called the Hospitaller, Julian merits at last the privilege of assisting Christ himself, or one of God's angels, in the form of a poor leper, whom he places in his own bed. Suddenly transfigured, the leprous stranger announces to Julian that his penance has been accepted by the Lord, who will soon take him to himself. The three saints' legends I have considered briefly here all present Christ disguised in someone poor and needy. They simultaneously present Christ as also hidden in the almsgiving saint, who is an alter Christus. In this reciprocity, human dignity is revealed in Christ as relational, the communion of saints. By one definition, the communion of saints refers to the holy things the saints hold in common, especially the scriptures and the sacraments, but also the treasury of the meritorious works of mercy. Not surprisingly, then, Martin's baptism, Catherine's Eucharistic reception, and Julian's penitential reconciliation are all associated in hagiography with narratives of the disguised Christ heralded in Matthew 25.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. These were such rich presentations with so many different angles at which to launch a discussion. Anyone who would like to start, I invite you. There's a microphone here. If you don't mind quickly introducing yourself and then stating your question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Madeline Olson. I'm a student at St. Thomas in Minnesota, studying art history and Catholic studies. So great admiration for you, Dr. Lev. But my question, you mentioned this idea of St. Joseph kind of as a father, and this idea of many children feeling though as orphans. And I would just love to hear like more of your thoughts on like the year of St. Joseph and St. Joseph in art, and how you think this will further influence our theology and our belief in the church of Saint Joseph as like the present father, especially in a society who really, has a plague of the absence of fathers.
Thank you. Joseph, in the Patris Corde letter of Pope Francis, there are so many aspects of how Joseph can address present issues in our society. And that is a helpful way, it's a helpful indication for artists. And we can see this throughout the history of the transformations of how Joseph is depicted. The first, we have theologians, or we have people who are speaking about church issues, who bring to the fore how Joseph could address these issues. And then we have artists who pick up on this. And really, it's not just artists, it's also patrons. There's somebody, in the case of the Sistine Chapel, where we have, the image of, where we have Sixtus IV, who is not only, he's not only the one who is going to declare the feast day of St. Joseph, but he'll also be the man who starts commissioning works of Joseph. So patronage is a very important part of it. And so it really, I think Pope Francis has given us an excellent opportunity to think about, we as people who like to consume and look at art, and not just painting or sculpture, but really even things like cinema, how this figure of Joseph could be adapted. And we see that he can take on many, 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 many guises. How can artists use this great figure and his example? And I think that's really a question that I'm throwing out to artists, and to patrons, and to society as a whole, how we can take up the baton of Josephine imagery and use it for a time that so clearly Joseph can respond to so many of our present ills.
Thank you both for such a wonderful, wonderful presentations. I have a question for Dr. Lev. It had to do with, it's a general question, but also specifics with respect to the painting of the Adoration of the Magi by Hieronymus Bosch. You point to the little tiny figure that's St. Joseph, and then so you identify it as St. Joseph, and then you say St. Joseph is drying a diaper. And so my question to you my guess is that if you were teaching a course on this, you'd have a lot more ways to describe to us how do you know that's St. Joseph, and how you know he's drying a diaper as opposed to doing something else. But how is it that you identify St. Joseph in these various paintings, and also how that you identify what's going on, what's being...
So the identification of Joseph doing kind of goofy stuff in the corner comes from there's one of the stories of Saint Joseph, one of the apocryphal stories of Saint Joseph. So the pseudo Matthew, where Joseph goes running off to do a whole bunch of things. So he's trying to find midwives, and he's trying to do this. In the meanwhile, Mary's just having the baby, right? And so there's a tradition of, in Northern European art, we find this tradition of Joseph who's just doing something else in another part of the painting. And so this particular figure, but the fact that he's drying these white cloths that, we sort of refer to as diapers more for comic effect than anything else, but really he's drying the white cloth, which is the cloth that's going to surround the child, right? So that already brings us back to the hosen, so the swaddling clothes that he is attributed to have given, but also this the idea of Joseph being around this garment that will enclose the body of Christ. So we can add to that the idea of even a humeral cloth. So the richness, that image is actually in true Hieronymus Bosch form. If you look at it quickly, it's funny. If you look at it more deeply, you begin to realize all of the elements of this drying cloth, this white cloth hanging in the background, draw out in the history, not only of Joseph, but in really the entire plan of Christ's salvific sacrifice. So it telescopes us from the beginning, when Jesus is first laid into a cloth when he's born, to when he dies and he's laid into another cloth, which is the shroud. So Bosch, it always takes a lot of thought. And he also conveniently likes to add completely random things that have nothing to do with anything, like a bunch of devils standing inside a doorway. So you have to kind of sift out the kookiness from actually everything in his work is highly symbolic. But in that particular case, the fact that he stands out in this little white figure himself, sort of the pure figure, is what indicates to us that of all the figures there, the one that must be Joseph is the man who stands in the corner and then gazes back over his shoulder to you, directly engaging the viewer.
Elizabeth, you didn't mention the Mousetrap.
No, I didn't mention the Mousetrap. The Mousetrap is very, that would have been like a whole subject in and of itself. There's actually remarkable work and a leaf of an altarpiece where we have Joseph playing with the mouse. Joseph has an incredibly rich iconography, particularly in Northern Germanic Netherlandish art. And so picking out all of these little elements where in the case of Joseph playing with a mousetrap, it suggests his assistance in divine plan and snaring the devil. It's again, way too much material for a very short presentation, but I just really more than anything else wanted to give you an idea of how much material is there, so that we realize that he's not just this kind of the guy in the brown outfit, but he's got a depth and a richness that really is worth exploring, and really worth sort of returning to that earlier question, worth bringing forward into this new generation.
Hi, I'm Teresa from the University of Dallas. I had another question for you, Elizabeth Lev, about Joseph. So you've spoken a little bit about how he's been brought forward as an answer to a lot of the church's questions or problems. So what do you think it is about Joseph and his various roles that has made him the answer to those questions throughout the centuries?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that, because I was sort of thinking, I wish I had sort of taken the time to really drive that home. I think it is precisely that silence of Joseph that makes him so extraordinarily versatile. I think it is a Joseph who, this comes out in really all the magisterium when Pope John Paul II or Pope Francis talking about Joseph, this willingness to be a figure that apparently takes a back seat. But in the meantime, the more you think about his role, the more you think about his similarities with Joseph the patriarch, the more you think about angelic communication, the more you think about his physical hands-on role with the raising of the child, at the same time a man who has to work for a living, at the same time a man who is married to the most extraordinary woman who ever lived. As people begin thinking about it, and because he doesn't get up like people like me and say, I think, he's not pigeonholed into any kind of, he doesn't pigeonhole himself into this is who I'm going to be. And it allows his identity to mirror, to form and to mold against all of our identities. And really, I think that's the fundamental aspect of the dignity of St. Joseph. So St. Joseph, who seems at the beginning barely worthy of being in these works of art, ends up, we start thinking about his worthiness. And really, Bernard of Clairvaux thinks about what makes Joseph worthy, and how that seemingly unobtrusiveness hides a greatness and really a multiplicity of gifts. And I think that's really what makes him, his silence is almost what makes him so great.
Thank you. Did we have any other questions from the audience? Oh, great.
My name is Ellen Friesen. I'm a student here at Notre Dame. Sister Anne, I had a question for you. You spoke in your talk about the Alter Christus, and I think that makes some degree of sense when we think about the saint who's maybe achieved a high level of virtue or union with God, or even somebody whose baptismal identity has conformed them to Christ in some measure. But I'm very taken with the stag in the story of St. Julian, and I'm wondering, what does it take? Like, what vision of the relationship between Christ and creation do we have to have such that even a stag or a beggar who might or might not be part of the institutional church in any visible way, what does it take such that they can be sort of worthy disguisers, or that Christ sees them as sort of worthy forms for his disguise?
Thank you so much for that question. I got thinking about this. I mean, obviously when I was reading that particular saint's legend, but last winter I had the joy of serving on a dissertation committee for a scholar at University of Toronto, and he was thinking about all the animals in the ark, and in particular the work of Hugh of St. Victor, right? And in that meditation on the ark, it's Christ, the slaughtered lamb, who's holds it all together. So at the peak of the ark, with all the animals, right? And he traced a long tradition in the church that his concern was with animal suffering, right? What do we make of it? It's not just the suffering that humans inflict upon animals, but that they inflict upon one another, right? So the reality of creaturely suffering. And he traced a long theological tradition that would say, that this suffering of animals is also meaningful, because the suffering of any creature in some way points us to Christ's own suffering, so that in taking on a human form, the human form is a microcosm. It includes the macrocosm too. And so there's nothing that is kind of excluded from, the power to point to Christ, right? And so, so we can find the Lord in all of his creatures, everything created through the Word. Yeah.
Thank you. We're 2 minutes past time. If anyone else would like to ask any other questions, that's not bad in terms of lateness. So we can, coffee's still going to be there. I'm tempted to ask one myself, but I need to read the room, the mood of the room. How bad do we need coffee? Yeah, so one thing that really struck me, especially Sister Anne in your presentation, but also it's really present in yours as well, Elizabeth, is the concept of dissimulation and of recognition, which really comes out in both of your treatments today. Why do you think? What can you say about the importance, recognition, of course, but why the dissimulation in the first place? Why the hiding? Why the veiling? And how important is this to the dignity of we as humans, and to the dignity of the subjects in the stories? That there is this act of concealment and then revealment, as it were.
These stories of Christ described, when I first heard them as a little girl, I thought, oh, this is a miracle. Jesus dressed up like a poor man, right? And it was Jesus, But there's the way the stories are actually narrated. When you see them as a commentary on Matthew 25, you realize that this is not, some kind of a extraordinary miracle, right? But it's pointing to the fact that Christ is always already, in the poor, in the people we don't see him, right? It could be the people, right beside us, right? That it doesn't have to be a poor person, but how hard is it for us to recognize Christ, in our neighbor? And I was thinking about the story about Francis when he kissed the leper. Right. So it's one thing to kind of, throw some coins at a beggar or, leave some bread on the street. And another thing to recognize Christ in that beggar. Right. It must be a breakthrough moment in a person's spirituality. Right. When they're actually able to see Christ in the other. It's not as if he is sort of masqueraded. Right. But rather he's there. And it's a matter of our unblinding, right? To see him present in another human being.
I would say that Jesus himself is kind of circumspect about who he is. So Jesus walks, he becomes man, he walks among us. People touch him, see him, know him, but they don't recognize him for who he is. Very few recognize him for who he is. And I think that allows him to be, I think Joseph is very much, as the understanding of Joseph grows, the understanding of Joseph as kind of same figure, very similar type of figure who first passes and nobody realizes who he is. That's what happens not only in art, but really in the history of his devotion. People don't know who he is. But then gradually he also reveals himself, and he reveals himself very much in this multiplicity of ways, because he ultimately, as the foster father of the new Adam of all men, and women, he in his own way will become a patron to whom everybody can turn. I think the beauty of Joseph is that the fact that he's not at the end of the day fixed into something that was set in stone 2,000 years ago is what has allowed him to be the patron of a universal church, so that everybody can go to Joseph. And that in turn is his own way of sharing in the experience of Christ.
Well, I think the time has come to thank you both for sharing your expertise, your knowledge.